Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you tuning in from around the world and all of you watching on the replay at home. I hope you're all doing very well. My name is Luke. I'm a producer here at How to Academy, and welcome to what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting event. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by Johann Hari, the best-selling author of Chasing the Scream and Lost Connections. Johann has written for The Guardian, Le Monde, The Spectator, Politico, The Independent, Salon, and many, many others. His new book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, is out now. And that, of course, is why you are all here today, to join Johann for a look at why we've lost our ability to focus, what are the causes, and most importantly, how we can get it back. So after a 40-minute or so lecture, Johann will take questions from you, the audience. So please type any you have in the little Q&A function wherever it is on your screen, and I will get to them a little bit later. Well, that's more than enough from me. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Johann Hari. Johann, over to you.
Cheers, Luke. Thanks very much. Hello, everyone on the internet. I really wish we were doing this face-to-face. I might talk a little bit later about why interacting this way is not good for our attention and focus, and I think you can all probably guess why. But I always get a little bit paranoid when I talk in front of one of my bookcases, because I don't know if you remember, but early in COVID, I might be misremembering this, but I think it was an Australian politician who gave us, did a Zoom interview from home, and people noticed that behind her in the bookcase, all she had were like the entire 82 volumes of the collected speeches of Adolf Hitler. And people were like, why do you have everything Hitler ever wrote? And she didn't have a good answer. So anyway, obviously I don't know all of Hitler's speeches, but please, if you spot anything incriminating behind me, please warn me. So I'm really chuffed to talk to you guys. I have really happy memories speaking at the How to Academy when my last book came out exactly 4 years ago. I'm thinking about that room and all those people and all those human faces and that feeling of attention and affirmation that I'm really glad you guys are all here, but is lacking, right? We don't feel like we're seeing each other, because in a very literal way, we're not seeing each other. And I was going to ask if you could all try to do something, and I will entirely understand if you can't. And please, when I finish speaking, just put in the address, the little chat box, whether you were able to do it. Luke will tell me. Try not to look at your phone or check your email while we're talking about the subject of attention, if you possibly can. I've locked my phone away. I'll explain that later, because I think we need to all pause and think about the subject. We need to pay attention to the subject of attention itself. And my journey into thinking about attention started in a slightly strange way. Started quite a long time ago. And it began for me, if I think about it now, with a moment with my godson, Adam. I'm going to slightly change some of the details to identify him, because he's a young person. I don't want to, don't want people poking at him. And when he was 9, he developed this brief but freakishly intense obsession with Elvis Presley. I never understood how he found out about Elvis, but he started kind of going around obsessively singing Viva Las Vegas and Suspicious Minds. And what was incredibly cute about it was that he didn't know this had become like a kind of cheesy, cliche. So he was doing it with all the kind of heart-catching sincerity of a preteen who thinks he's being cool. And he used to get me to tell him the story of Elvis's life again and again and again. And I would often tell him the story. I tried to skip over the bit at the end where Elvis, shits himself to death on the toilet. And I remember one night when I was tucking Adam in, he said to me, Johann, one day, will you take me to Graceland? And I said, yeah, sure. In the way that you give promises to 9-year-olds, knowing that like a week later, they're going to want to go to, Disneyland or, some other place, right? They'll just forget about it. And he said, no, do you really promise you'll take me to Graceland? And I said, I absolutely promise. I didn't think about it again until 10 years later, when everything had gone wrong. He dropped out of school when he was 15, and he I can see the little thing where I can see the chat. I'm just going to block it so I don't get distracted by it. See, this is another attention technique I'll explain later. He dropped out of school when he was 15, and he was in a really bad way. By this time I'm thinking of, he was 19. And I remember we were sitting, you can't see this because it's behind my laptop, but we were sitting on the sofa over there. And one day we were sitting there, and it's like he was whirring at the speed of Snapchat, when nothing still or serious could touch him. He seemed to spend his whole life alternating between devices, between his iPad and his phone, between WhatsApp and YouTube and porn, this blur, this slurry. And it was very hard to get any sense of traction with him for anything. And one day we were sitting there and I was kind of horrified by this. And I was horrified at myself because I was sitting there staring at my own phone in a way that, if I'm honest, was not so dissimilar. And I just said to him, hey, let's go to Graceland. And he was like, what? He didn't even remember this obsession he'd had when he was a little boy. And I said, no, let's go to Graceland. We have to break this numbing routine. We have to get out of this numbing routine. We have to get some sense of presence back. So I said, look, we'll go all over the South. We'll go all over. But in return, you've got to do one thing. You've got to leave your phone in the hotel when we go out, right? Because it'll just do my head in if you're just going around looking at your phone the whole time. And he promised. And 2 weeks later, we set off from London Heathrow to New Orleans. We went there first. And when we got to Memphis, when we got to Graceland a couple of weeks later, when you arrive at the gates of Graceland, there's nobody to show you around anymore. There's no physical person. This is even before COVID. What happens is you're handed an iPad when you arrive, and you put in earbuds, and the iPad guides you around. It says, go left, go right, go here. A voice, some famous forgotten actor, explains the room you're in, the history of it. So what happens is people walk around Graceland staring at their iPads. And so I'm walking around, I'm getting more and more irritated. I'm trying to make eye contact with people to go like, oh, this is funny. We're the people who traveled thousands of miles and actually looked at the place we traveled to. And I was only able to make eye contact with one guy. And I was about to say that to him, and I realized he'd only looked away from the iPad to take out his phone and take a selfie. When we got to the jungle room, which was Elvis's favorite room in Graceland, there was this Canadian couple next to me. And the husband turned to his wife and he said, hey, honey, this is amazing. Look, if you swipe left, you can see the jungle room to the left. And if you swipe right, you can see the jungle room to the right. And I laughed. I thought he was joking. And I looked at them and I saw his wife was swiping back and forth. And I was so taken aback. I said, but sir, there's an old fashioned form of swiping you could do. It's called turning your head, because we're actually in the jungle room. You don't have to look at a digital representation of it. We're actually there. And of course they thought I was insane, possibly rightly, and they backed away. And I turned to my godson to kind of laugh, to go, look, isn't this crazy? And he was standing in the corner, looking at his phone, flicking through Snapchat, because from the moment we arrived, he couldn't keep this promise. He was so compelled by these apps. And I felt so angry. And I went up to him and I said, I know you're frightened of missing out, but this is guaranteeing that you will miss out, right? You're not present at your own life. You're not showing up at your own life. I tried to grab his phone off him, which of course, again, understandably, he marched off, and I wandered around Graceland on my own for a few hours. And I found him that night in the Heartbreak Hotel where we were staying, which is just up the street from Graceland. And he was sitting, I can remember it so clearly, he was sitting by the swimming pool, which is shaped like a guitar, and they play Elvis songs in a constant loop. And he was looking at his phone, and I went up to him and I apologized for getting so angry. And he's looking at his phone and he said, I know something's really wrong, but I don't know what it is. And that's when I thought, maybe I need to look into attention, this subject of attention. It's something that had been hanging over me for a while. For a long time, I felt like with each year that passed, things that require deep focus that are really important to me, like reading a book, watching a long film, were becoming more and more like running up and down escalator. You know what I mean? I could still do it, but it was getting harder and harder. And I started looking at some very initial provisional evidence. I was quite struck by it. The average American office worker, for example, now focuses on any one task for just 3 minutes. For every one child who was diagnosed with attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children given that diagnosis. I started to think, could there be something happening here? But I also thought, look, I would reassure myself by saying every generation thinks this, right? Every generation, you get older, your brain starts to deteriorate, and you mistake the deterioration of your brain for the deterioration of the world, right? And that you can read letters from monks almost 1,000 years ago, writing to each other, saying, oh, my attention ain't what it used to be. That's not an exact quote from the monks, but that's the gist of what they said. So I reassure myself by saying, well, this is just a perennial human problem, right? Like love and death. It's just an inevitable. And of course, there's an aspect of it that is certainly a perennial human dilemma. But really, it was thinking about the young people in my life that made me think, no, you know, I want to look into this. Because even if it's a perennial problem, what should we do? But also I suspected there was something bigger going on. So I ended up going on a really big journey all over the world. I traveled over 30,000 miles. I went from Moscow to Miami to Montreal to Melbourne. Also went to places that didn't begin with an M. I don't know why I did such alliteration. And I wanted to, and I went to meet over 200 of the leading experts in the world about focus and attention. And I learned that there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention worse or make it better. And I learned that loads of the factors that have been making our attention worse have been significantly rising in the last few years. And many of these scientists believe that we are in an acute attention crisis that has to be dealt with. And one of the most important things I learned from this is that your attention didn't collapse. Your attention has been stolen from you by these big forces. And if we're going to get our attention back, I think we're going to have to protect ourselves and our children from these forces. And then we're going to have to take on these forces and stop them doing this to us. That can sound like a big and daunting thing. So the book is about bringing you on the journey in which I came to these conclusions. And it was really striking to me, these scientists, how disturbing some of what they said was. Professor Earl Miller, one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, who I might talk about in a bit in a little while, said to me that we live in what he said called a perfect storm of cognitive degradation at the moment. Professor Joel Nigg, who's one of the leading experts on children's attention problems in the world, said that we need to start asking if we're living in what he called an attentional pathogenic environment, an attention that systematically undermines your ability to pay attention. Professor Barbara Domeny, one of the leading French scientists, she's won the Légion d'honneur, the biggest civilian honor in France, said to me, it is not possible to have a normal brain today. It was quite sobering, this thing that can seem like quite a small thing to us. Attention, when I followed the trail, it was connected in all sorts of ways to so many of the aspects of how we live, far beyond tech, including tech, but far beyond it. And also connected to so many of our problems, both it's caused by our problems and our inability to pay attention is causing many of our other problems. And I'm just saying, as a starter on that, think about anything in your life you've ever done that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, learning to play the guitar, being a good parent. That thing you're proud of required a huge amount of attention and focus. And when attention and focus break down, your ability to achieve your goals and your ability to solve your problems starts to break down. And when you become a person who can't pay attention, it's almost like, the way I began to think of it is like you become a stump of yourself. You can sense what you might have been if only you've been able to apply yourself, but you become lost in this fog of bullshit that we're all being kind of consumed by. And I came to this journey in a difficult way, because when I started on this, when I couldn't pay attention, I would blame myself, right? If I couldn't pay attention, I would say to myself, oh, you're weak, you're lazy, you're not good enough, you don't have enough willpower. And funny enough, there was a moment about willpower at this very early in the research for the book. I went to interview a brilliant scientist named Professor Roy Baumeister, who is the leading expert on willpower in the world. If anyone, a lot of you will have heard of the marshmallow test. He's the guy who invented that. He wrote a book called Willpower, right? So I went to interview him. You can hear the audio of this on the book's website, stolenfocusbook.com. And I went to go see him, and I said, oh, you know, I'm thinking of writing a book about attention and trying to figure out if it's getting worse. And he said to me something like, it's funny you should say that, because I found that my attention isn't very good anymore. You know, I just play video games on my phone all the time. And I sort of sat there and I was like, wait, didn't you write a book called Willpower, right? Like, aren't you the willpower guy? And you're saying to me that you just play Candy Crush all day. Oh my God, is this literally happening to everyone? And because I was still stuck in the belief that this is a failure of my own personal willpower, I decided to pursue a really radical solution, which taught me a lot, not least the limits of this kind of solution. When I got back from Memphis, I was so disgusted with myself and disgusted with what I was seeing happen to so many people that I just announced to a load of my friends, look, I've been online for, what was it by then, 15 years, right? So much of the time, I was just tired of being wired. And I announced to everyone, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going away for 3 months and I'm going to have no laptop that can get online. My friend Imtiaz gave me his completely knackered old laptop that can't get online, and no phone that can connect to the internet. I'm done. I'm out of here. And I booked, and I appreciate I was extremely privileged and fortunate because my previous books are so well that I was able to do this and my film had done well. That I booked a corner of a beach house in a place called Provincetown, which is at the tip of Cape Cod. It's a little gay town. I don't know if any of you know Provincetown. To give you a sense of Provincetown, it's a place where more than one person earns a full-time living, dressing as Ursula, the villain from The Little Mermaid, and performing songs about cunnilingus. It's a great place. And Provincetown, it was the ideal. I thought of it as like this perfect kind of purgatory, because it's Provincetown. One of the really great things about smartphones is Google Maps. I have an appalling sense of direction. Have a condition called dyspraxia, which means I find it very hard to remember directions and things. And so I had to choose somewhere that was very simple. In Provincetown, there are 2 directions: go left, go right. It's just one long street along the beach, along this gorgeous beach. You're basically in the whole Cape. You're basically on the edge of a sandbar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Thoreau said that you could stand in Provincetown and feel the whole of America at your back. And I remember when I arrived, I remember getting the ferry over from Boston. I left my mobile and my laptop in with my friend in Boston, and I got the ferry over. And this was the technique I was using here is an extreme form of a technique that I recommend everyone try for things they want to achieve, which is called pre-commitment. I interviewed one of the experts on this, Professor Molly Crockett at Yale. So pre-commitment is where you want to do something in the future, but you know you'll crack. So an obvious example for me would be Pringles, right? One of my nephews recently pointed out to me that I look uncannily like the Pringle Man. Not flattering. That's why he's been cut out my will. But so for me, a form of pre-commitment. So I can buy Pringles, put them in my cupboard and say, when it gets to midnight, I just won't eat the Pringles, right? And I know that I will just crack and eat the Pringles. So a form of pre-commitment would be to not buy the Pringles at all. When you're in the supermarket, you're binding your future self. So we can talk a bit about how you can use pre-commitment with attention later, but this was an extreme form of pre-commitment. I was leaving the devices behind. And I remember when I was on this ferry and there was this wet flapping Stars and Stripes next to me, I remember I suddenly had this memory of the very first time I ever saw a mobile phone. And the very first time I ever sent an email, I must have been 13, 14, something like that. I was on the 340 bus in Wealdstone, if anyone knows it. I was on the top deck coming home from school, and a man was talking on a mobile phone, and everyone on the top deck turned and stared at him. And it seemed like this incredible, in my memory, the phone is like the size of a small cow. That can't quite be right. And I remember we all turned to him, and it seemed like this incredible intrusion, this extraordinary rudeness. And so we broke the golden rule of British people on public transport. We looked at each other, and someone turned to the guy and said, "Mate," and he said, "Yeah," and he said, "You're a wanker." And then I sent my first email. It seems staggering to me when I think about it now. At university, I remember sending it and just thinking, is that it? If you had told me then that whatever it was, 17 years later, I would be fleeing on a boat from a mutant combination of these 2 technologies, I would have thought you were completely insane. So I arrived in Provincetown, and I remember that those first few days just feeling this incredible haze of decompression, right? And how the tremendous relief that I felt, and having but still not quite being able to focus. And for that first week or 2, I was still sort of skimming everything. I remember reading David Copperfield and skimming it and be like, "Come on, Dickens, okay, I've got it. He's an orphan, get on with it." Like in that extractive form of reading, as Nicholas Carr, the writer Nicholas Carr puts it, that we get from the internet, which was so sad because that's one of the deepest loves of my life, is reading fiction. And then I began to relax into it. And one of the incredible things I learned in Provincetown, one of the things that blew my mind, was how much and how deeply my attention came back. I thought I had degenerated, but within a relatively short period of time, and this is not just because of the tech, it's because there were many things that changed in Provincetown: how I ate, how much I slept, how much stress I was exposed to, a whole range of factors. I was able to focus, like when I was a teenager, I was able to sit there and read for 8-9 hours a day. And I'm conscious that this is going to seem like a fuck you to a lot of people watching, because people will be watching thinking, but I can't do that, right? And of course, we can't do that in our ordinary lives. And so a big part of what I kept thinking about all the time is, but how we're not going to all convert to the Amish, right? We're not going to throw away our phones. How do we integrate the insights from the best scientists I met, from what I was experiencing in Provincetown? Is there any way we can integrate that? These are the questions I was asking into our everyday lives. I started to think a lot. You know, it's interesting. I remember one day having felt so much better, and one day walking down the beach, just off Commercial Street in Provincetown, and seeing this thing that had been scratching at me since before Memphis, which is there were loads of people who were just, you know, not looking at the Provincetown, one of the most beautiful places in the world, who were just using it as a backdrop to take selfies and staring at their phones. But this time, instead of wanting to go to them, oh, you're wasting your lives, you're not being present, I wanted to run up to them and go, give me that phone, mine, right? Because this is a very pretentious way of putting what I'm about to say. But Simone de Beauvoir, the French philosopher, much better philosopher than Jean-Paul Sartre, her partner, she said that becoming an atheist was like the world going silent. And I realized that for me, suddenly being cut off from the internet, even by my own choice, was like the world going silent. I had been trained for so long to become accustomed to the thin, insistent signals of the web. And suddenly they were gone. And that initially felt like a relief, and then felt like everything, like I wasn't getting any signals from the world. You know, Mark Maron, the comedian, said that every Facebook status update could be boiled down to the underlying sentiment, will someone somewhere please acknowledge I exist? And that may be a bit hyperbolic, but there's no ordinary social interaction involves people flooding you with hearts, right? I realized that I had created a vacuum where all these signals that I had become accustomed to for years were. And so I thought, well, you have to fill that vacuum. And I started to think a lot about a science I'd actually learned about years before. And when I left Provincetown, I went and interviewed the man who pioneered this science, an incredible man named Professor Mahali Csikszentmihalyi. I think I did the last interview. Yeah, Vidika, sadly, he died a few months ago, and I can't find any other interviews he did, although it could be, there might have been one that I can't find. And Professor Csikszentmihalyi, and you have no idea how long it took me to learn how to say that, how to pronounce that, was the pioneer of a science that many of you will have heard of called flow states, which are really important for us to think about attention.